Bodies slid down a dark chute, ejected by a system that no longer had use for them. There was nothing to hold on to but panic and a false hope of freedom. The passage was slick with an unknown red substance, sending them hurtling forward like discarded products on a factory line. Though it seemed like lubricant, the faint reddish hue whispered of something more sinister, that this might not be an escape route, but a disguised slaughter chute. Yet in the distance, a flicker of light appeared. They perceived it as an exit. But in a world like this, even light can lie. They were spat out of the chute like factory waste, flung into the air for a moment, suspended between helplessness and hopelessness, before crashing down onto a shadowy surface. The sound of bodies hitting the ground echoed with the cold indifference of a machine fulfilling its task. One of them winced in pain, struggling to gather himself, while the other remained seated, breath heavy and stunned, not out of relief, but from the unsettling realization that they weren't dead, just dumped into the next phase of this waking nightmare. Amid the rubble and shadows, the body of a man lay sprawled grotesquely, his face crushed, an eye pierced by a finger, his flesh still warm though his soul had long departed. One of them approached, not out of sympathy, but paralyzed by a flicker of human shock. Yet reality snapped back swiftly. This was no place for emotion. They stood in a corporate hunting ground, where even a second of hesitation could mean death. There was no time to mourn the fallen, for the system never pauses, and the exit remained somewhere ahead. Among the shadows and scattered corpses, the air hung thick with the stench of death. The walls bore the smeared handprints of those who struggled in vain, a mass grave without ritual, where the system disposed of those deemed obsolete, yet who didn't die right away. Shallow breaths and shivering limbs whispered that hell wasn't a place, but a slow, methodical process. Amid the freezing silence, a sliver of hope appeared in its most basic form, a door. Like hunted animals spotting an open cage, they dashed toward it, not out of certainty, but because their bodies hadn't yet given up. Just as their steps approached a glimpse of salvation, violence surged once more from the shadows. A large hand clamped down, yanking one of them back and shattering the fragile sense of safety that had only begun to form. In an instant, instinct overrode thought. There was no time for reflection. Before him stood a disfigured remnant of the system's cruelty, a face mangled, yet eye still brimming not with madness, but with conscious ruin. This encounter was not a battle of life versus death, but a forced duel between victims, each made to decide who must fall first. From a shattered face and flickering consciousness, a spark of recognition emerged, not of an enemy, but of someone once dear. Amidst wounds and madness, she clung tightly, not to attack, but to confirm an identity nearly erased. Her body trembled, her mouth struggled to form a name, as if summoning a lost past buried beneath suffering. Yet the reality of this world is merciless. Even love, if any remained, couldn't withstand the damage imposed by the system. Her scream echoed not just from pain, but from a rage born of betrayal against the very core of what it means to be human. Madness dug deeper as the beloved turned into a threat. A gentle touch twisted into a frantic grasp, the once familiar face had become a mask of pain and broken sanity. In an instant, anguish and panic collided, not from fear of death, but from witnessing how the system had gutted reason and love from someone once fully human. He fell, thrown backward, but the pain that lingered wasn't physical, it was the desperate effort to reach what was left of her humanity. Amid the horror, he cried out, not to save himself, but to call back a soul being pulled into oblivion. He writhed on the floor, caught in a cacophony of broken sounds, far removed from the language he once knew. His body remained alive, but his mind had been scraped down to a shell of chaos. His friend could only watch in silence, resignation setting in, knowing that the chance to save him had long passed. A memory of the kind, gentle person he once was flickered briefly, only to be crushed by the truth, this system could reduce a human to something unrecognizable. As they walked away, one question echoed in his heart: just how far can a person break before they're no longer human? His steps were heavy, not from wounds, but from a weight he couldn't share. He walked away, leaving behind what was once a friend, now reduced to an unredeemable fragment of suffering. The words of apology hung in the air, not meant to heal, but to quietly admit that some of this was the system's fault, and perhaps, a little his own. What remained of Itsuki was beyond saving, and he knew that trying to remember him as whole was merely an act of ego. Yet still, deep within, all he truly wanted was to be forgiven. After facing horrors and losses that tested the very limits of humanity, they stood before something deceptively simple, a door. But behind that simplicity lay everything at stake, the possibility of freedom, or yet another trap. With trembling hands, they worked to unlock a path forward, placing their final hope in a key and a basic trick. When the lock clicked open, a faint warmth cut through the frozen tension in the air. A subtle smile emerged, not as a celebration, but as a quiet acknowledgement that they were still alive, at least for now. As the door creaked open, white light poured in, flooding the darkness that had held them captive for so long. In their eyes, it was the light of freedom, not just from this physical place, but from the nightmare that had torn their spirits apart. Hope surged in their chests, as if the world beyond the door promised relief, justice, perhaps even humanity. Smiles began to form on faces battered by fear and exhaustion. But in a world governed by such a merciless system, moments like this are too perfect to trust. Because often, when someone thinks they're finally free, that's when the true trap begins. What once seemed like freedom had led only to a wider, brighter, and deadlier space. Beneath the cold crescent moon and the harsh glare of artificial floodlights, he stood alone, surrounded by barrels of rifles aimed straight at his body. There was no room to run, no time to think. The promised outside world wasn't an escape, but a stage for execution, meticulously prepared. Amid the silhouettes of the armed and the watching, one truth became undeniable: the system didn't just want to dispose of the unwanted, it wanted to do it with a spectacle. Darkness filled the space, not from the absence of light, but from a truth too heavy to bear. The once hopeful face now hung in quiet resignation, gaze cast downward, as if already knowing what was to come. Beside him, his companion froze, caught off guard by a confusion that struck like an invisible blow. The silence roared louder than any scream. Something had shifted, and one of them had realized a truth the other had yet to accept. And in that silence, a new fear took root, not of the guns outside, but of what was unraveling within themselves. Tension crept like poison through the air as they stepped into the ring of rifles. The blinding floodlights offered no comfort, only a harsh stage where every barrel was already cocked, ready to erase. Behind masks and visors, cold eyes stared forward, delivering threats in mechanical tones, like factory instructions devoid of empathy. This world left no room for choices, only submission or destruction. And in that deadly silence, even the slightest movement could be enough to justify erasing a life. Resignation crept into their breath, like a slow poison killing off hope. They stood at the heart of judgment, surrounded by weapons and the quiet indifference of a system that offered no space for excuses. One of them lowered his head, burdened by the weight of guilt, not only for being trapped himself, but for dragging his friend down with him. In his mind, a single thought began to form: if there was no path to freedom, then perhaps, at the very least, there could be a choice, one he could still make, even if it led to ruin. In a moment of desperation, he made his choice, to act as a threat, not to harm, but to protect. His arm wrapped around his friend's neck, not in violence, but as a final shield, a last-ditch performance to slow the inevitable collapse. Yet even this reckless move was no match for the voice that followed, cold, familiar, unmistakable. A figure stepped out from the shadows, one they knew, carrying with him an authority that could not be resisted. With a single sentence, he shattered the illusion of control. And the fragile spark of hope began to fade once more. Amid the stage of oppression, the most unexpected figure emerged, a man exuding authority, formal calm, and a voice disguised as warmth. The father, a living emblem of the system itself, didn't arrive to save anyone, but rather to reframe the moment. With composed grace and a rehearsed smile, he declared his son's achievement as though it were a graduation, not an execution. Yet among all his words, the most terrifying thing was his serenity, for behind that polite mask and dinner invitation was the quiet revelation: he knew everything, and still allowed it all to unfold. Their bodies were dragged with force, but resistance met only with cold stares and mechanical procedure. Amid the humiliation and helplessness, the father's voice returned calm, refined, and utterly false. He said Toru's name as if it were a polite introduction, not the context of a capture. He spoke of his son like a proud legacy, comparing curiosity to inherited brilliance, as if this entire situation was an intellectual case study. Toru felt the words cut deeper than any weapon, reducing him to nothing more than a subject of interest. And what hurt most, the smile behind those words was genuine, in the most horrifying way. With a voice calm yet cutting, the father delivered his most brutal words like a scholar presenting a theory. He didn't shout, didn't wield weapons, but his language struck harder than bullets, that the difference between humans and livestock wasn't just systemic, but rational. He stood atop a scaffold of discrimination and deemed it natural, declaring that a system to determine who deserves to be called human was merely moral efficiency. And behind that composed smile, there was no hatred, only conviction. A cold, unwavering belief that you were never meant to live free. With calm precision, the father extended an offer cloaked in formal civility and political maneuvering. Obedience would be rewarded, rebellion quietly erased. He didn't need to threaten, his authority was absolute, woven into every word. This wasn't a negotiation, but an elegantly veiled command, and Kip Pei, standing beneath the spotlight like an actor on a dystopian stage, chose to nod. A small all right, heavier than defiance. From a distance, Toru watched, his heart torn between awe and dread at the sight of someone surrendering not through force, but through the quiet realization that there was nowhere left to stand. Escorted like a defeated beast, Toru walked aimlessly while every fiber of his body screamed in defiance. The insults hurled by the guards cut deeper than the restraints biting his wrists. Not only was his freedom stripped, but his very dignity as a human being had been erased. In the distance, the luxury car door closed quietly behind the victor, whisking him away in calm triumph. Meanwhile, Toru was dragged into the belly of a system that spoke only one language, power. And in the end, the only thing he could release was a long, hollow scream, echoing with despair, heard by no one who mattered. In one final surge of defiance, Toru screamed, not out of fear, but as the purest act of resistance, a raw voice unconcerned with whether it would be heard. Dragged and surrounded by the hands of authority, his body weakened, but his will burned bright. He refused to be forgotten, refused to vanish silently like a statistic on a report. His shout was not a plea, but a challenge, a declaration that even in chains, even as a livestock, he would continue to haunt the system that tried to erase him. And in the still night, as the black car rolled away, one truth rang clear: his spirit had not died, even if his freedom would soon be buried. Inside the smooth-gliding luxury car, their conversation unfolded like an intellectual parlor game between two generations of predators. The father floated the idea of keeping a human as a pet with the casual tone of a dinner suggestion, and Kip Pei replied with a half-smile, perhaps because part of him realized he was beginning to adopt the same logic. Their exchange wasn't just dark humor, it was a demonstration of how power warps morality. When Kip Pei questioned the idea of equality, his eyes were empty, not because he lacked understanding, but because the system had already taught him to stop searching for meaning. The car glided smoothly down the slope toward a city glowing like a sea of artificial stars, a world grand on the surface, yet rotting at its core. Above, the fading sky watched silently as traffic lights blinked without meaning, just another cog in the ever-turning machine. Behind the vehicle, a lone insect zipped through the air, small, insignificant, but alive, unlike the humans who had already been tamed by the system. In the lingering conversation within the car came the suffocating conclusion that a modern human should not think, nor feel, only accept and function. Not because it's right, but because it's how the system ensures its own survival.